fiction, science fiction, horror, fantasy, crime, LGBT, thriller.
You have now entered the House of Mystery with your hosts, Eric Shapiro, David North Martino, John Copenhaver, and Al Warren. Heard on KCAA 106.5 FM Los Angeles,
102.3 FM Riverside,
and 105.0 AM Palm Springs.
Welcome back into the House of Mystery. I'm Al Warren. We got Mr. Dave Martino.
Hello, hello. Hey, Al.
You said that cautiously. What's going on over there?
I don't know.
I think something's
making me nervous,
on.
Al. I think that's what it is.
I think something's going on, and you're not telling me. You know, something. Well, it's your birthday's coming up the weekend, so you're 73.
Yeah, just about right.
Okay, so
51. 52. I mean, 52. Actually, 52. No,
yeah. I always forget the age as well. I stopped remembering back in, I think, when I was 57, something. I don't know.
I'll be 39 for the 13th time. It's like Jack Benny.
Yeah. You keep saying Jack Benny. I keep telling you, there's not a listener alive
who remembers
Jack Benny. I was just watching his shows, too. It's funny because... But I think about things like that, and come on, we mentioned to that horror guest a while back about Austin Powers, and they didn't know who that was. Right. Austin Powers.
Who's
They're
that?
not going to know Jack Benny,
Well, I'm old at heart, Al.
Yeah, I'll say.
That's what it is.
I'll say. Some old somewhere. Anyway, now... See, that would be my segue. I was supposed to say, speaking of old, but that's not, no. So now we're going to kind of go into a true crime today, and we haven't done that in a while. We got a big true crime month coming up too. So, anyway, today, we've got an author of a book called 12-26-75. And it's Tony Reid. So thank you for being here, Tony.
Greatly appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much for having me.
Well, Tony, so what is going on in your life here? You've got this book out here, and it's called, we said 12-26-75. So what's the basic idea behind this book? Like, what is it?
Well, the reason that the book is titled that is it's the date of the homicide in question. And in my mind, it's the turning point for what should have been the moment when Joseph DeAngelo could have been stopped before he went on to kill 12 more people in California. And he's, I think, most well known under the moniker the Golden State Killer. But in essence, in that exact moment of time, he was still a active duty law enforcement officer. He was a sergeant with the Exeter Police Department. And that was his first of two jobs as a peace officer in California. He went on to serve in Auburn. And, at that moment, Joe DeAngelo had elevated to the rank of sergeant. He was head of a local burglary task force. He was also the head of the violent crimes unit for Exeter PD. So when we think about, what that was like for a police officer to have that level of power, what could you accomplish if your intentions were less oriented towards law enforcement and perhaps more towards crime? So that's really what we're talking about is in my mind, this is the moment where things could have and should have turned. And the reason that the date is so important is that's the date of the homicide in question.
Okay. So now we're talking about the homicide of Donna Jo Richmond.
Yes.
And, you say this is when it could have turned.
Yes.
And he could have been prevented from going on to do all the horrendous things he did.
Yes.
So what do you describe the problem? Like, why did this go wrong, and why is it that he was able to continue on?
That's a really important question. And I think in any examination where something goes wrong, you kind of have to look at the moment where things could have turned and why they went the way they did. And I think when officers showed up at the scene where Donna Jo's bicycle was found on that date, December 26, 1975, that they decided in that moment that they had the right idea for who this person was. Within minutes, they thought they knew what the crime was. And really, that is the heart of what happens in a wrongful conviction, is this tunnel vision, this obsession with the idea that one particular person may have committed the crime. Really, in essence, now what we know about wrongful convictions is that we can prevent this by having officers slow down, call for outside help, ask for assistance, make sure that they're double checking their procedure. And I'm not talking about necessarily second guessing their decisions, but I'm talking more just about the basic protocol for how an investigation proceed. And that's definitely not what happened here in Exeter. We do know is that within minutes of showing up, they found at the scene where Donna Jo's bicycle was recovered, they found an invoice book. And that invoice book had Oscar Clifton's name on it and had some writings inside that were definitely his. He never denied that the invoice book was his. What he maintained was that he had no idea how that book got there. The last place he saw it was in Visalia, and that's 15 miles away. So how that book got there is the one mystery that I can't solve, even after all of the time that I've spent looking at the case. I have a few ideas, but equally important, the other thing that's found at this location at this time is a small jotter notepad. Basically the kind of notepad that you would see a police officer have, writing down notes for an investigation. 3x5 size. And in that notebook, in that notepad, was just basically some numerals, no handwriting of any other kind, just some numerals. And the thing that I've been able to establish about that other notepad, we have some photographs of the 3 pages, so we know what they look like. And that handwriting is a very solid match to the handwriting of Joe DeAngelo. I have his police reports for the time that he was a sergeant with Exeter Police Department. I've included some images of both the notepad itself that was recovered at the scene in Exeter, as well as the numbers that we have from his police reports in Auburn. And they're indistinguishable. In my mind, that's the first thing that we need to look at, is to say, was there a nexus between these individuals? Was he there? Obvious from the fact that this was a violent crime. It was in Exeter, and he had every reason to be called to that scene. In addition to that, this notepad basically disappears from evidence. It is introduced at trial, but it's quickly acknowledged by the officers that it wasn't Oscar Clifton's. Therefore, they said, well, it has no connection to the crime, and it wasn't investigated or clarified whose notepad that was. So from the very moment this case starts, the focus of everything, the complete, honest investigation of what happened here was over in 5 minutes. And what happened immediately is that evidence starts to move. The scene starts to change. And once the officers decide that they know who did it and they're wrong, things start to move around. And that includes some of the evidence from that scene.
You also, I know that you mentioned that you kind of mentioned corruption, and you talk about the lead investigator, and that, some of the trial evidence was destroyed.
Yes.
And stuff. So when you come to that kind of an accusation or a statement, does anything ever really happen to an investigator like that after these years? Do police or does the court ever go back and kind of go, oh, well, this person should be punished? What's the result of something like that?
It's so rare. It's shockingly rare. It is becoming a little bit more accepted and commonplace that police officers are misconduct by an officer is at the root of corruption. But this is so new in terms of society's reckoning with this problem. There was a really interesting case in Indiana that unfolded in 1982. A young man was hauled out of class as a junior in high school. He was a promising football athlete, completely innocent of a crime. He was misidentified as being a possible perpetrator. As soon as, and this was related to a burglary and a sexual assault, and as soon as the evidence kind of came in that said, wait a minute, this person didn't have any connection to the crime, the officer destroyed some of the exculpatory information. They went ahead and charged him anyway. He ended up serving his complete term for the crime he did not commit. Then, as soon as he filed suit after he was released, he said, wait a minute, the evidence that would have cleared me was destroyed and you did this. As soon as he filed suit against the officer, a new charge suddenly appeared from this same department, from the same officer, and they charged him with the murder of a police officer in a nearby town. And so he was then convicted by the same officer, by the same corrupt officer. He was convicted of this additional homicide. And the remarkable part of the story is that second conviction was completely manufactured. And it was done so simply because he did not want the defendant to go through and identify this corruption from the first instance. And just recently, like 2 months ago, this whole matter was resolved. The civil suit was finally allowed to proceed. He has been exonerated of both crimes, the original crime and of the homicide. And what we're left with is a very clear picture. This officer was completely corrupt in his investigation, completely manufactured all of the evidence to convict the person in the first place. And his only, and this happened so long after the time of the original crimes that, he'd already retired. He was already receiving his pension. And for all I know, he's still receiving a pension, even though he committed these egregious crimes against an individual. I think what we're left with is the need and the appreciation that there has to be more checks and balances for claims of this type of behavior. When there is so much implicit trust of police officers, prosecutors, judges, that when an allegation like this is being made against individuals in power, the system, the protections that we have now protect the individuals who are in the system. They do not protect the defendants. They do not protect the innocent. That's what our system is supposed to do. It's supposed to have these guardrails. Instead, what we have is a system that just continues to protect those who are capable of corruption, and in some rare instances do commit this type of action. In my case, the individual involved was the detective sergeant with the local sheriff's office. He should not have been the lead investigator on this crime for the simple fact that the individual who was murdered, Donna Jo Richmond, a 14-year-old girl, he was the sheriff's detective here, was a close family friend. Of course, in a small community, that's likely, but he was more than just that. He was, in essence, her godfather. He had been present at the time of her birth. He worked for the family prior to becoming a law enforcement officer. He was their ranch manager. There were so many deep connections. And for instance, on the stand, when he gets up to testify at trial, he talks about his close connection and how, and the reason that he worked so hard on the case was that, he had been such a close family friend for many years. That's exactly the kind of individual that you don't want to be the lead investigator. There are so many emotional biases that you start to form. And I think very quickly what he realized is that there wasn't enough evidence at the scene to implicate the individual that he thought was involved. And there was another massive problem here, and that is that the individual who ends up being implicated in this is named Oscar Clifton. There was a longstanding bias and hatred that existed between those two individuals, an animosity that's documented elsewhere. And, when you've got those two elements that are working now together, there's so many problems that manifest with that kind of activity. How that eventually takes form in corruption is that within 6 months after the a death sentence is finally given to Oscar Clifton, the detective in question here had ordered the case evidence to be destroyed. Every stitch of evidence that was in their possession at the time, important distinction later on in the story, is ordered to be destroyed. All of the physical evidence, all of the biological evidence. He assures that everything is that he thinks that is in existence. He orders it to be destroyed. In a capital case, especially, it's very important that evidence is preserved as long as the individual is in custody, and that can be until the person dies in custody. It can be until they're executed. It can be anywhere. So long as that person's jeopardy, their liberty is in jeopardy, it is required that the state preserve the evidence. And for an officer to go out of the way, not just to allow evidence to be spoiled or for some inadvertent bad action to happen to it, that's not bad faith. What happened here is a specific order: find everything, locate it, destroy it, and that sealed the fate for the later DNA testing that could have exonerated Oscar Clifton. We know that there were hairs and fibers. We know that there were fingernail scrapings, there were swabs, there were any number of items that could have and should have been in existence, and they were specifically ordered to be destroyed by that same officer. That is absolutely criminal. And as a matter of fact, California does have a penal code that says explicitly if case evidence is destroyed in such a case, that is a capital crime. And one of the things that's important about a capital crime is that the statute of limitations doesn't expire. In other words, this individual could still be charged if there were anyone who was willing to pick up such an investigation, civil rights violation. That person could still be charged. It's unforgivable. It really is. It's incomprehensible to understand what happened in this case, but it's the kind of thing that does happen when something other than your motivation as a law enforcement officer is involved. If there had been some kind of oversight, some kind of other involvement, I don't think the case would look the way it does now.
Well, kind of in the same vein, do you believe anyone, whether it was Joe DeAngelo or the lead investigator, do you believe anybody planted evidence like the notepad to point towards Oscar Clifton? Is there any evidence to suggest that?
Well, actually, it's very interesting that that's one of the main MO points of the East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker, as an offender. One of the things that it helps if you're a criminal to know how crimes are going to be investigated, and there are I want to say at least 5 or 6 instances throughout the East Area Rapist series where mysterious items of evidence are taken from one scene and moved to another location. We know that that's something that Joe DeAngelo did as the perpetrator known as the East Area Rapist. He would move stolen items. He would break into a home. He would steal items of little monetary value and then leave them in a different home. He would leave personal possessions. He would take small items, and people would find them in their home and say, what is this? For that offender to have simply taken the invoice book from Oscar Clifton's truck where it was last seen in Visalia and put that out in Exeter is absolutely 100% understandable, especially given the timing of when that happened. What we're looking at for the crime, again, December 26th, Joe DeAngelo was not identified as the Visalia ransacker until he was apprehended in 2018 when he confessed to that crime. What we do know is that in Visalia, the investigators there documented several instances where items were taken from one scene and planted in another. And as a matter of fact, that was one of the things that very early on when I was working with the original lead investigator from Visalia, John Vaughn, that was the one thing that he kept reiterating, say, how did I know that the Visalia ransacker and the East Area Rapist were the same offender? It was this particular habit of taking items from one scene and moving them to another. That's exactly what we have in the Richmond case, is this great mystery of how Oscar Clifton's invoice book ended up out in Exeter. We also know that 2 different items of loot from the Visalia ransacker were taken from Visalia and planted out near Exeter, very close to the scene of this homicide. This was in September, so 3 months prior to the homicide, but we have items that are actually taken from Visalia and found in Exeter. This is not in any way a stretch of imagination to suggest that the same individual did this 3 times, not just 2 times.
A whole part of this too, like you talk about wrongful convictions and
Yes.
And kind of how that happens and why it happens and
Yes.
And also false confessions.
Yes.
Right. That's
Yes.
another big part, right?
It
and there's
is.
so many of that, but people still don't really buy into that a lot. I had this on the show before and talked, and I know a lot of listeners still will kind of come back and say, well, how can someone actually confess to something they never did, and what? And they kind of have this doubt toward it. So how do you respond to stuff like that?
I think for the same reason that torture is not allowed, we're talking about conditions that are very close to torture for the individuals that are involved. I think the other thing that you have to understand in some of these cases, you're talking about individuals who don't have enough information about their rights in the first place. The first right that you have is to say, I don't want to talk to the police about anything until I talk to my lawyer. So for anyone who's listening, your first step is to say, lawyer. Your second step is to say, what is the mental state of a false confession? Because a lot of the individuals involved are not of higher capacity. The low IQ is associated with very problematic confessions. But I think too, when you start to look at the circumstances of what the false confessions are, you're talking about instances where questioning goes on for the better part of 10 or 12 hours of uninterrupted time. And police officers are not supposed to mislead an individual, but they do. This is not prohibited. In actual fact, they can say, we have evidence that connects you to this scene. You're better off if you tell us now. And in some instances, it's so close to torture that the individual just says, I relent. And I think I can go home if I just tell you what you want to hear. There's a fantastic series earlier this year on HBO about homicide in Kansas that 5 people ended up through different confessions, ended up through the same misconduct. One main lead officer confessing to crimes, saying that they were at the location, when clearly the DNA evidence said that they were not. There was one single profile and none of the individuals arrested. What ended up happening is the police said, well, if this person's connected, let's find a friend of theirs and maybe they're connected. They get charged. By the time they were done, they had 5 people who ended up separately confessing to a crime that they did not commit. How could something so widespread have happened? And it's the same exact problem that I mentioned earlier. It's this tunnel vision. It's this blind belief that these individuals committed the crime, and we're going to make this stick. Right now, there is a move towards reforming this. And for instance, a new element of training for police officers is in wrongful convictions. How did these things happen? And Illinois, for instance, has just passed a requirement that all officers take a class in wrongful convictions, and assuring that, we don't deal with tainting eyewitnesses. How do we make sure that the information that we're getting from eyewitnesses doesn't just say, we want the crime to stick against this person. How do we follow the evidence that actually existed at the scene, and how do we get the correct evidence? That's the correct strategy. That's the right metric that we should be asking, instead of, I think it was this bad guy. I've had trouble with him before, and we're going to run him down, and we're going to get everybody to agree that that's the person who did it. That's how wrongful convictions happen. And the sad reality of that is that, when we look at saying, why would an officer do that? When they know that the real problem then is that this other person is allowed to escape, the person who actually committed the crime, and go on and perhaps do more. The real tragedy as well is that the original crime is unsolved, and that person has really a fake version of justice. If something happens and that conviction's overturned, like for instance in the case where I mentioned with the case in Gary, Indiana, with this young guy who's hauled out of class in junior and high school, railroaded through the system, and has now he's the only person in the National Registry of Exonerations to be listed twice. First for that original conviction, and then for this homicide of the police officer. It's kind of shocking that he's now on the Registry of Exonerations twice. And the sad thing is that if you look at I think it's like the Fallen Blue website, the officer's case is still listed as solved because there was a conviction against this guy. And the sad reality is that conviction was never valid. His case is completely unsolved. When we are looking at the victims of wrongful convictions, it's not just the person who ends up in prison. It is the fact that a false justice was rendered, And the victim of the crime is left now wanting real justice. I know that the people of Exeter I've received multiple emails. I've had conversations with locals, and there is definitely a mixed set of emotions about the book and about the facts and circumstances revealed here. There are a number of people who are saying, your book's had a real impact on the community, and people are concerned that there was not real justice here, and that the killer has not been held accountable for the crimes, and we're left with the pain too of the wrongful conviction. That's what happens when the justice system jumps too quickly and makes these kinds of mistakes. This is the painful legacy of wrongful convictions. This is why this has to be stopped. Why we can't just jump on some evidence, any evidence. Why we can't just jump on some defendant, any defendant. Yes, when a horrible crime like this happens, when there is a brutal homicide, we all want justice to be held. For instance, like in the case of the four people in Moscow, Idaho, who were murdered there, and we're looking at now at this suspect Brian Kohlberger. Everyone should be making sure that the evidence is correct, that we know exactly who did it, and that his rights are preserved, that he receives a fair trial, and that we don't just jump to say, well, we know who did it now. We've got this DNA lead. What we're required to do is to go through all of the steps, make sure that his rights are protected as to get a fair trial so that everybody gets the correct answer. If we don't, we'll end up with a different problem.
No, I guess now the person that was convicted of it was Oscar Clifton.
Yes.
And so now I guess there's been DNA about him, and I guess he's possible match to what was found on the victim, but DeAngelo, they say, isn't. So
Right.
What do you say about that? Like, how do you explain that?
So what this is, when I first got involved in this, I said, hey, look, I think there's a wrongful conviction here, and approached the DA's office and approached the Attorney General's office and said this needs a careful reexamination. What's supposed to happen when a complaint like that originates is there's supposed to be involvement with defense and investigators, and there's supposed to be an open and honest evaluation of the case evidence. That didn't happen. Instead, what happened is the DA's office got a hold of the 2011 testing that was done. Oscar Clifton had put in a demand for DNA testing as soon as California passed its law to allow what's called the 1405. It allows any individual who's incarcerated to have DNA evidence tested. So what happened here was when he put in his request, first, the state denied that any of the evidence still existed to be tested. And ultimately, after, I want to say, 6 or 7 years of legal wrangling, some slides were found to be at the original lab. And these were hair comparison slides. These weren't collected as part of the evidence. These were things that, in essence, as things were sent to the lab, different items were picked off and examined, and the person went through. He was a hair comparison expert. So what he did is he gathered up all of these different items, and he created, I think it was a total of 46 different slides for his purposes. What he found is that none of the evidence that he was asked to examine would have implicated Oscar Clifton. In other words, none of the victim's hairs were found on the defendant. None of the defendant's hairs were found on the victim. And so, he gave that as his testimony, but he kept these slides. And after a careful examination, when they said, hey, wait a minute, where is the biological evidence it's supposed to be here? Everyone runs around in a flurry and says, well, what do we still have that could be tested? What could satisfy Clifton's right to a 1405? So they find these slides in Berkeley, and they're bundled together. And the most important point about the original case and about the examination is the question of whether or not there was a sexual assault. Because, in other words, for this evidence to have any meaning, for the DNA to have any meaning, there would have had to have been some kind of evidence of a sexual assault that also the biological evidence of that matched Oscar Clifton. In 1976, that was done by blood typing. What we do know is that the material that was tested from and collected before it was destroyed was submitted and examined for blood type. And at grand jury, one of these criminalists specifies that it was type A that was found on this material. When we look at Oscar Clifton's blood type, it's an O. That is completely exculpatory. When we look at the integrity review document, there is an absolute demonstrable lie about that evidence. And that is that what they say in their report is that there was no blood typing done. It's right there on page 56 of the grand jury testimony. The criminalist says it's type A. What should have happened is that should have been illuminated at trial. And for whatever reason, defense counsel either forgets about it, doesn't do it, or is not interested in doing a good job for his client. Whatever the reason was, I don't know, but it is not introduced at trial. It's not in the transcript. But there it is, clear and plain and simple. It's also in the test results. It's in the bench notes. We have a type A on there, not a type O. So there's your first indication that something's terribly wrong with this. Second indication is that in 2011, when this evidence is being examined, a partial DNA profile is produced on that slide. And what that is, it's a slide labeled VPH, Victor Paul Hank. And that stands for victim's pubic hair. What that slide is was a small collection of the hairs that were found, and they were mounted to a slide. And then they were examined for DNA. When the criminalist is going through and conducting his analysis of that, he does what's called a Christmas tree stain on that slide. And he uses that as a way to say, is there any indication of human spermatozoa, seminal fluid, anything like that would have been consistent with a sexual assault? So in order for there to be the conclusion that the DNA that was on the slide was related to a sexual assault, you have to say that, I swabbed the hairs and I found a component of the seminal fluid. This Christmas tree stain is applied to materials, and the reason it's called that is the head will light up in red and the body will light up in green, so it looks like a Christmas tree. And anything that's another precursor to seminal fluid will light up purple. In the notes, in the bench notes for this examination, the criminalist makes it clear that there is no seminal fluid. There is no indication of any semen. But he goes ahead and he runs the test anyway on the hair itself. What we do know is that there were 3 allele locations, 3 allele profiles that were developed. One of those would not be consistent with Joe DeAngelo. All 3 of them would be consistent with Oscar Clifton. That sounds damning. However, the main point of any examination like this is that we have to know what the source of the materials actually was, what was being tested. And what we do know is that the condition of these things, all 46 of these slides were all bundled together. And the way they were collected is this person who was going through and doing the hair analysis had out all of the different hairs related to the case all at the same time. He was mounting the slides and manufacturing things. We don't know what that material was. We don't know if it was one of Oscar Clifton hairs that inadvertently got mixed in with the victim's hair. All he's doing is a hair analysis. It could have been epithelial skin cells. It could have been any number of things that was a cross-contamination that resulted in that profile. The one thing we do know is that it was not semen. It was not in any way related to a sexual assault. And that would be required for that conclusion to be reached. What is actually astounding about that same DNA report that the prosecutors are using in this matter, there are two really imperative points to understand. One is that there was documented contamination in that evaluation process. Every time a DNA test is run, you're required to do not just the main body, but a confirmatory test that there wasn't any contamination in the process. You want to make sure that what you're testing is actually just the item of evidence and not anything that came floating in from the room or from the analyst himself or anything else. So you want to make sure that everything is pure and you're only getting the case evidence tested. There is an allele bump in what's called the reagent blank. What's supposed to be pure, it should be all zeros. And when you have an actual identified allele sequence in your reagent blank, that means you have contamination. Something else got in the room at the same time, and it shouldn't be there. And your whole test needs to be redone at that point. Your test is scientifically invalid. It belongs in the garbage can. That happened in this case. There was not enough material left over to redo the test. What the criminalist should have said was there is no conclusion that can be made. There was accidentally contamination. He failed to document that. It is in the bench notes, and you would need the bench notes in order to confirm that. I've offered that this has been provided to the Attorney General's office many times, and they're just simply shrugging their shoulders and saying, too bad. That's exactly the problem here that's at the root of this. We have that along with the fact of this A and O blood type mismatch. And when we're looking at this again, because there was no sexual assault and there was no evidence of a sexual assault, all that was created this confusion in the first place was what's a positive precursor test. There was, in fact, acid phosphatase reaction, but an acid phosphatase is simply to say, is phosphatase present? Phosphatase can be found in citrus peel. It can be found in soil. It can be found in all sorts of different things. It's the way that you establish whether or not in this huge bed sheet, where do I look for spermatozoa? You apply the phosphatase, but you have to do the confirmatory test. In this case, the confirmatory test said no semen. In this case, the confirmatory test had actual contamination in the reagent blank. It belonged in the garbage can. But moreover, the conclusion at the bottom of this report, the criminalist says no analysis can be done. No conclusion can be drawn from this report. That same report is the one that the DA's office are using to both exonerate Joe DeAngelo and to continue to implicate Oscar Clifton. That is a miscarriage of justice. It misrepresents the report, and it lies about the source of the material. It is unforgivable that that is the legal conclusion. If there were an evidentiary hearing on this matter, that report would be dismissed. This matter would be resolved in a completely different fashion. That's not acceptable.
So, so we're with Oscar Clifton. So, does he have any options left? Like, he's in jail still to this day, right?
No, he is not. He's deceased in 2013.
Oh,
yeah.
So
that really changes the matter entirely. When your rights to a habeas in California and rights to post-conviction relief are done as soon as you're deceased. You die in custody, your rights are gone. There is, however, one lingering remedy. Oscar Clifton was a veteran. And like every veteran, he would have been entitled to not just to veterans' benefits, but to a military burial. That is exactly where his family wants him to be buried. His ashes are simply waiting to be interred at this time. And their family wants a burial at a U.S. military cemetery. He's denied that right of the military funeral because any veteran who has a felony conviction for a capital crime is not allowed to be interred in a veteran cemetery. That means that he still has a liberty that is being denied by the state by this wrongful conviction. And that's something that's another avenue that we're pursuing at this time. There is one last lingering hope here there's one liberty that's still being impaired that we can pursue.
Do you think the original intention of the prosecutor during the crime and the original conviction, was that his intention? Do you think he purposely knew that Clifton was probably not guilty or whatever, but he just wanted to put him away anyway?
It's a very interesting thing because, again, we're looking at 1976. And so you kind of have to get in the time machine and go back to what was going on with all of this. In this instance, this particular prosecutor is something of an outlier for the community. He came into office in 1974. He was a Democrat. He was formerly the public defender. Very much inconsistent with the values of this community. But when we look at 1974, when he came in, that was exactly when Watergate was unfolding. And there was a lot of backlash against Republicans, and he barely won his seat. I think he won by 42 votes and a fairly, thousands of votes counted. So, less than a percentage point, I think, difference for his opponent. And what ended up happening is that he was such a he was viewed as being someone who would be weak on crime. And so I think in many instances, he kind of overcompensated. He tried to, it's kind of like the problem with Democrats and how they're viewed on the defense. They end up being very hawkish because they don't want to be viewed as being soft on these things. So he was definitely over prosecuting a lot of crimes. He had backlogged the court so seriously with all of the other crimes. Instead of taking plea deals and everything else, he'd really ticked off a huge number of the judges and attorneys, and everybody was saying, wait a minute, what's going on here? So I think when this crime crossed his desk, there was a real problem on his hands because he did not want this very high profile crime to be seen as that. Right away, you can see real problems with his approach in this case. He lies about the sexual assault immediately. That he misstates the evidence within days. He knows that, for instance, there was no rape, and yet he puts in the newspaper as soon as the indictment is handed down. He's going after rape charges. Those aren't dismissed until quietly right before grand jury when it's changed to an attempted rape. But he's so tainted the community with his high profile press statements. He's lied about the evidence from the very outset. And I think the other interesting thing to know about this prosecutor is that the murder conviction that was immediately prior to the Clifton case starting was overturned for prosecutorial misconduct. His office was again misstating evidence and leading the jury to false conclusions. So, do you have an overzealous prosecutor? Yes. Do you have someone who's being, demonized in the community for being soft on crime? Yes. Do you have all of these factors that, make a prosecutor want to do something like this? Unfortunately, the answer is yes.
Now, at this point, do you have social media? I see you've got a podcast
Yes.
as well, and of course the book. So how do you want people to find out about you or connect with you or give out all your information here?
Sure. There's a lot more information about the case and about the book, the background on the website, which is the same name as the book, 122675. There's social media as well, very active Facebook group, thousands of followers, and the podcast itself has 42 episodes, some of them multi-parts. All of the evidence is broken down. Everything we've talked about today, about everything from what does a conviction integrity review look like? What should this be? What does prosecutorial misconduct look like? Why does it happen? What happened in this case? What was the actual evidence? You can hear from the actual police reports. You can, some of the images of those are on the website and social media. So that's the best way to engage with this. Of course, there's an author page on Genius Books. You can find out more information there. And, check out some of the reviews. I think you'll find that people are very moved by the emotional part of the book, which is that, a wrongful conviction has happened here and not all of them can be remedied. And we're left with this mixed bag, this terrible legacy of in essence, an unsolved crime. And we have another homicide that happens about the same place, about the same time. Her name was Jennifer Armour, and very much strongly consistent with the same actions. I think this was another unsolved DeAngelo crime.
Okay, we'll have all that up on our website as well, so people can find you and find your podcast and book, and it's certainly worth looking into. So now, of course, the book is called 122675, and I guess so is the podcast. Our guest, Tony Reid. Thank you for being here.
Alan, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate the opportunity to get the word out.
Thanks, Tony.
You've been listening to the House of Mystery radio show. To find out more about our guests, hosts, or shows, go to www.houseofmystery.com.
Show's over for now.
Was it as good for you as it was for me?
Well, good night.
This has been a production of Something Weird Media.
I'll be back.